Hello everyone, I'm Priyadarshini Mara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, University of Delhi. Today, I'll be discussing with you module number 27 of paper number 11, Philosophy of Buddhism. Now, this module is entitled as Law of Causality. If you see the title, it says Law of Causality. Now, what is causality? Causality is something that points out to the ever-conditioned nature of phenomenal existence. According to Buddha, everything is dependently arising, and that points out to the causal nature of phenomenal existence. Now, what Nagarjuna did was, on those lines of Buddha or Pratitya Samutpad or the doctrine of dependent arising given by Sakyamuni Buddha, he expounds that way and forms this law of causality. When we look at the Sarva Darshan Sangrah, which was written by Buddhist scholar and thinker Madhavacharya, it is stated in support of the Madhyamik doctrine that the self or the knower, the object or the known, and knowledge are mutually dependent. When we look at the self is the one that is the knower. The object lies outside and becomes the known. And the knowledge that we derive with the object and the self contact, these three are mutually dependent. The reality of one depends on each of the other two. And if one is false, then the other two also must be false. So you see that when one, either the self or the object is false, then knowledge necessarily has to be incorrect or false. Now let me give you an example. When we perceive snake in a rope, the object perceived in the rope, that is snake, is false. Hence, mind that knows such an object trains or acts out to be false, and the knowledge becomes false. Therefore, knower, known, and knowledge are called to be mutually dependent, and if one of them is false, the others must also be false. So, can you make out the connection between these three? How essential it is for these three to be mutually dependent in the right way. If one of them points out to something that is false or incorrect, then the rest of them also turn out to be false. The Madhyamik questions the reality of knowledge. Now here when we talk about law of causality, we see that Madhyamik questions the reality of knowledge. Commonly, it is held that in and through knowledge, our mind becomes directly related to the object. But the Madhyamik points at that contradiction is inherent in the nature of things or objects. When we talk in the general terms, or we take into consideration the other sects of Buddhism, we see that they state that the mind in and through, or the knowledge in and through our mind, becomes directly related to the object. But according to Madhyamik, they point out that the contradiction is inherent in the nature of things or object. That contradiction lies in the nature of things or object. Now, Madhyamik give two conditions here to state out the contradiction that lies in the object or things. First one is when we say that we directly perceive a pot. Is the pot a whole here or an aggregate of parts? When we talk about perceiving a pot, we say that it is directly perceived. So, are we talking about perception of the whole or only the parts? Now, if it is an aggregate of parts, it must then be an aggregate of atoms, isn't it? When we talk about an aggregate of parts, if we say that this is an object and it is an aggregate of different parts, so then necessarily it must be an aggregate of atoms. Atom is imperceptible. An aggregate of atoms should also be so. Hence, the pot cannot be perceived if again the pot is held to be a whole. Then the relation between the part and the whole becomes inexpressible. Therefore, one cannot say that the pot is perceived either in parts or as a whole. Now, the second condition the Madhyamik gives is that it cannot be said definitely whether the pot exists or not. Now, why cannot it be said that whether the pot exists or not? If the pot has been existing all alone, how can we say that the pot that it has been produced? If that it has been existing all by itself, then there couldn't have been any production of that pot. Because here we are not giving its cause. We are just saying that it exists all alone. Now, if again we argue that the pot was non-existent before coming into existence, then we shall be pointing out or predicating both existence and non-existence of the same thing, which is a contradictory notion or nature. How can we say that it can be both existing and non-existing? Now, when we look at these statements given by Nagarjuna, we see that the law of causality is explained in Sakyamuni Buddha's discourse of Pratitya Samutpat, and it is presented in order to explain the origin of samsara or dukh, which is suffering, and it also points out to repeated cycle of existence or suffering again, and also to the cessation or nirodh of samsara and dukh, and finally points out to the attainment of nirvana, which is the state of eternal peace or eternal bliss. Nagarjuna employs the method of fourfold dialectics, which is also known as Chatushkoti, in order to lay down the Buddhist law of causality. So when we talk about the Buddhist law of causality, we see that Nagarjuna employs his fourfold dialectical method or Chatushkoti in order to explain what this law of causality states. When we talk about the Madhyamik philosophy, we see that it was already present in the Pragya Paramita literature. Nagarjuna only developed it. His original contribution was the dialectical method that he propounded, and he provided a deeper and more critical explanation of the doctrine of causality. When we look at the dialectical method, we see that it has origin of dialectical method, and we see that there is a structure of the dialectical method and also the development of dialectical method. There is a meaning of the dialectic, the technique of the dialectic, the structure of the dialectic, and also the purpose of the dialectic. When we talk about the meaning of the dialectic, we see that it is, in plain words, that movement of thought which, by examining the pros and cons of a question, brings about a clear understanding or clear consciousness of the conflict in which reason gets stuck, and hints at a way of the impasse by rising to a plane higher than reason. So that is the meaning of the dialectic. When we talk about Nagarjun's dialectic, we say that it is a movement of thought. By examining the pros and cons of a question, brings about a clear consciousness or understanding of the conflict in which reason gets stuck. It does not, however, leave us here. It also hints at a way out of that impasse by rising to a plane higher than reason. So that is the meaning of dialectic. Now when we talk about the structure of dialectic, we see that the structure of dialectic clearly articulated and finally understood thus as the first alternate of the tetralemma. Tetralemma is also given to the dialectical method. It's a name that points out to the same dialectical method. So this first alternative of the tetralemma consisted of a positive thesis, the second of a negative counter thesis, the third of a conjunctive affirmation of the first two, and the fourth one points out to a disjunctive denial of the first two. So when we look at the structure of this dialectical method, we see that first we have a positive thesis, second we have a negative thesis, third we have conjunctive affirmation of the first two, positive and negative, and fourth we have disjunctive denial of the first two, positive and negative. So that is the structure. Now, when we look at the technique of the dialectic, we see that the dialectic was a rejection of views by reductio ad absurdum method. So the technique that we use is called reductio ad absurdum. Now, what is this reductio ad absurdum? This means that the knowledge as prasang, when we talk about prasang, we see that it is more like a debate. There are people, they raise their positions and the others try to bring out contradictory or conflicting nature of their positions. And this is how you bring them down to the level of zero or nihilism or contradicting their own positions. So that prasang method or reductio ad absurdum method is the technique of dialectic. Now, when we look at the purpose of the dialectic, it was to disapprove the view advanced by others. So, main purpose for Nagarjuna to construct this dialectical method was to disapprove the views advanced by others and not to prove any view of his own. So remember, when we talk about the dialectical method, Nagarjuna is stating dialectical method or Chatushkoti in order to disapprove the views which have been raised or advanced by people around him, and he has no view of his own to present. Nagarjuna clearly states in Vigraha Vyavartini that no one can find fault with his Madhyamik, for he has no view of his own. So when we look at Vigraha Vyavartini, we say that Nagarjuna states clearly in that particular text that no one can find fault with his method because he has no view of his own to advance. He who advances a view must necessarily prove to others, otherwise his words can mean nothing or can be brought down by the method of negation. When we look at the application of the dialectic, we see that Nagarjuna applies his tetralemma or the dialectical method to following. Applying his tetralemma to causality. When we talk about the application of the dialectic, we see that he's applied his dialectic to causality, and he says that there are only four views about causality. So first we've seen the meaning of the dialectic, then we've talked about the structure of the dialectic, then we talked about the technique of the dialectic. After that, we talked about the purpose of the dialectic, and now we see the application of this dialectic. So when you ask me why are we talking about the dialectical method when we have to talk about causality or law of causality, I would like to point out here that law of causality is further extension of this dialectical method. Applying his dialectical method, he brings out four views of law of causality, or four views of the causal nature of phenomenal existence. So an understanding of this dialectical method is essential in order to bring about these four views and in order to point out to the contradictory nature of the four possible causality or causal laws of existence. Now what we're going to understand here is that Nagarjuna picks up this dialectical method. He constructs his dialectic in such a way that the laws of causal nature, which have given by different schools of philosophy, are brought down in contradiction or in contradictory nature. So when he applies his tetralemma to causality, Nagarjuna says that there can be only four views about causality. And what are these four views? They are Swata Utpatti, Parata Utpatti, Dvabhyam Utpatti, and Ahetu Utpatti. We would be talking about these four views of causality in details, but for now, just understand that there are these four views which are Swata Utpatti, which means production from self, Parata Utpatti, which means production from another, Dvabhyam Utpatti, which means production from both self and another, and Ahetu Utpatti, which means production from neither self nor another, and by chance of production. Now, when we talk about law of causality, the first question that would come in anybody's mind would be, why did Nagarjuna employ Chatushkoti? So, now to answer these question or this question particularly as to why did Nagarjuna employ Chatushkoti method? So there are two possibilities. One was to lay down the Buddhist teachings of the middle way regarding causation and its doctrines. And the second one is to show that while causation and dependent origination in themselves are the very core of Buddhist philosophy, but one should avoid clinging on to them as dogmas. So these are the two possibilities. One is to lay down the teachings of the Buddha of when he gives teachings of the middle way regarding causation and its doctrines. And the second possibility is to show that while causation and dependent origination in themselves represent the very core of Buddhist philosophy, one should, however, avoid clinging on to them like dogmas. So it says that there should not be any clinging on to these causalities or to these notions of philosophical aspects like dogmas. Now, when we look at Mool Madhyamik Karika, which talks about the laws of causality in detailed exposition, we see that the first verse of Mool Madhyamik Karika says, Na swato napi parato, na dvabhyam napi ahetu, utpanna jato vidate bhavah kacchayan kacche. So, what are we trying to say? Na swato napi parato, na dvabhyam napi ahetu, utpanna jato vidate bhavah kachane kachan. So here this means there are no existence evident anywhere that have arisen from self, other, both self and other, and a non-cause. So you got an understanding of what we're going to deal with. Now, our area of study here is going to be that there are no existence evident anywhere that have arisen from either self or other or both or a non-cause. So these four possible views of causality are being rejected by Nagarjuna. So here what we're trying to say is that the entire phenomenal existence can be placed under the category of these four laws of causality or these four natures of causality. And now how Nagarjuna is going to deny or going to bring out the contradictory aspect of all these four causality. Okay, so the first one would be Swataha Utpatti, which means causation by self. Sarvastivād as well as the non-Buddhist school of Sankhya presented an identity theory of causality, and that is known as Sat Karyavad. When we talk about Swata Utpatti, we see that it means causation by self. Now, who propounded or who held up this doctrine of Swata Utpatti? So this doctrine points out to everything in the phenomenal existence is the reason or outcome of causation by self. Sarvastivadins and Sankhya school pointed out to causation by self in their theory called Satkaryavad or identity theory of causality. Now, when an effort seems to arise, it does so because it was already in some sense present in its cause. Its appearance is just the manifestation of something that already existed. So what Nagarjuna states is that when an effort, or this is the theory of causation stated by Sankhya and Sarvastivadins, we say that when an effect seems to arise, it does so because it was already in some sense present in its cause. Its appearance is just the manifestation of something that already existed. The intrinsic nature of existence does not exist in its conditions. So we see that the intrinsic nature that we're talking about of its existence, it does not exist. If the intrinsic nature or own nature, which is known as Swabhav, of the effect were to be found in the cause, production would be rendered meaningless, for there would be mere self-duplication, not the emergence of more prominent factors. A seed, for example, would produce only another seed and not a tree. When we talk about a seed and if we say that it is the cause of self, causation by self, we say that if we're talking about a seed, then it would be producing only another seed and not tree. Then it is said by Nagarjuna that when the cause cannot be accepted to be partially actual or partially potential, it would then be accepting two conflicting natures in the same thing. So accepting a cause to be partially potential and partially actual does not make sense, because here by doing so we are holding up to the conflicting nature of the same thing or to the two conflicting natures of the same thing. Then we see if the cause is wholly potential, even then it is said it cannot become actual without any extra means or efforts. Example, when we look at the production of a pot, then we cannot say that if the outer factors, that is the clay or the potter or the wheel do perform their actions, a pot cannot be produced. Buddha believed that self-causation leads to the belief in eternalism, that is Sashvatvad. And the belief in eternalism leads to advocate self-causation, that is posited in the object itself. So, unchanging nature or self is pointed out here, which is not the case of the phenomenal existence. The entire phenomenal existence is endowed with the changing reality, and this can be said to be the reality in order to define the positions of various other schools. When we talk about the conditioned reality, it cannot be said that self-causation can be pointed out here because conditioned things are dependent on other factors for them to come into existence. How can we say that a seed or a pot for that matter turns out to be in themselves a whole because of themselves, and they don't require any outer production or any outer effect? That is not true. So this way Nagarjuna denies Swata Utpatti or causation by self. Now coming to the second category or the second nature of causality or the phenomenal existence can be placed according to some thinkers or some Buddhist non-thinkers as well as some Buddhist thinkers, that Parata Utpatti or causation by self is the law or nature of causality. So when we talk about Parata Utpatti, we see the existent arises from something distinct from itself or production from another. The Asatkaryavad theory of causality, which was held by Naiyayic and as well as Swatantric. So this is called Asatkaryavad, which points out to production from another, and it was held by the Naiyayics of the Indian philosophical thought and also by the Buddhist Swatantrics. Now what does this theory has to say? It says that there is the absence of substance or own nature, which means Swabhav. There cannot be other nature. So when we say that there is the absence of substance or own nature, then there cannot be other nature, which means Parabhav. When these people or when these schools hold up Parata Utpatti, which means they are denying the self and believing in the other self. So can you talk about Swabhav or Abhav without there being the opposite? No, till the time there is no bhav, you cannot talk about abhav. Till the time there is no swabhav, you cannot talk about the non-existence of swabhav. So a thing to be called non-existent, it has to be present. The cause and effect have no relationship. There can be anything being produced by anything. With such randomness, causality will be itself rendered meaningless. When we talk about the cause and effect, and if they have no relationship, then anything can be produced by anything. And with such randomness, the causality will become meaningless. If there is no intrinsic nature, then the extrinsic nature is not found. So until and unless there is nothing believed to be intrinsic, there cannot be anything extrinsic. There is no fire without heat. When we talk about fire, we need to talk about heat because that is the characteristic of fire. Buddha believed that non-identity leads to annihilation or uchedva. When we pointing out in the last Swata Utpatti, we stated that Buddha, according to Buddha, that production from self pointed out to Sasvatvad. And here, according to Buddha, the production from another points out to Uchedvad. So, this leads to another extreme of denying altogether the causal efficiency of individual violation or the faculty of using one's own will. So, these are the two extreme positions that were for sure denied by the Sakyamuni Buddha. One is Uchedvad and the other one is Sasvatvad. So here he is denying these two extreme. Nagarjuna is picking up the middle path by denying these two extreme positions, which is of self-production and of production from something other than the self. So that is Swata Utpatti and Parata Utpatti, in which the characterization or the phenomenal existence can be put together. When we look into the other two aspects, we see that the other two natures of causality or the possibilities of placing the phenomenal existence into the causal law is Dvabhyam Utpatti and Ahetu Utpatti. So, when we see that Dvabhyam Utpatti means origin from both. Now, what is this origin from both? This origin from both means Swata Utpatti as well as Parata Utpatti. So we see that it is written with the inconsistencies of both Swata Utpatti as well as Parata Utpatti, and that is the reason Dvabhyam Utpatti is also denied. Then comes Ahetu Utpatti, which means origin from a non-cause, which also points out to the production or origin only by chance. So what are we trying to say here? Or why did Nagarjuna deny this Ahetu Utpatti? It is because when we talk about production by chance, then anything can be produced at anything and there will be no one taking the responsibility for their action. The entire ethical system will collapse because if we believe in Ahetu Utpatti, then any immoral action that we perform, no one is going to take responsibility for those actions. So the moral or the ethical value of the world will collapse or come to an end. And this is how Nagarjuna points out that the law of causality states the cause and effect relationship, and these four possibilities, which are stated by different schools of Buddhism as well as non-Buddhist schools, these all four can be denied because they are all ridden with inconsistencies. So therefore, there is no such law of causality, except for the fact that everything is in a causal and effect relationship and everything is dependent on certain other factors for its existence. And this is the law of causality given by Nagarjuna. But he also states that you should not stick on to it or hold on to it as a dogma. Thank you.